Hey, what's happening, y'all? I'm jamixdowns with intessionmusictech, and welcome to my vocal reverb mixing masterclass. And I'm really amped up about this one because I've always been so fascinated about reverb and how it's able to do so many things within the music production process and how to be able to use it effectively, not just on vocals, but really just mixing as a whole, and how it plays such a vital role in all areas of a song, but none, of course, more important than the almighty vocal. And that's what this tutorial is all about. So let's get into my vocal reverb mixing masterclass. But first, before we get into the tutorial, if you need a professional mix and master and want me to mix your music, go to jamixdowns.com or click the link in the description and follow the fast and easy 3-step process. And remember, all of my mixing and mastering services have a 100% money back guarantee to make sure you're completely satisfied with the final result. So in my opinion, reverb is one of the most important and powerful effects processors we have in the grand world of music production, and learning to use reverb effectively on our vocals literally be the difference between a bad mix and a good mix, and a good mix and a great mix. But that, of course, is at a macro level of using reverbs. But at the micro level, it takes a lot of skill and experience for us to be able to find the right reverb type for a specific song and a specific vocal, and dial in the perfect settings for that vocal to sit in the mix just the way we want it to. How to maximize creativity with our reverb is where the real challenge lies for most of us when adding reverb to our vocals. And in its simplest form, the most obvious function that reverb serves us is to give our vocals a sense of space and depth in the mix. But in creating this space, reverb simultaneously sets the tone and emotion of the mix as well. And it's in shaping this tone and emotion that takes much more skill and understanding than just adjusting a couple of knobs on a reverb plugin. And I think the main objective when using reverb on our vocals is to find that right balance of creativity, space, dimension, and separation without muddying the mix, and keeping the vocal clear, intelligible, and packed full of emotion. And this, to me, is the ultimate challenge and responsibility we have when using reverb on our vocals. And that's exactly what this masterclass is all about, showing you the techniques to accomplish this consistently in every mix, regardless of the DAW or reverb plugin that you might be using. Aside from understanding and applying the technical aspects of reverb, using reverb is one of the most creative tools we have in mixing, and understanding how to use it creatively is just as important as learning the technical aspects of using reverb. So in this masterclass, we're going to cover both the technical aspects of applying reverb to vocals and also explore the key creative uses of reverb as well. And even though this tutorial is focused on vocal reverb techniques, remember that a lot of these are fundamental reverb techniques, and the information you'll learn here can be applied to instruments as well. In this tutorial, we're going to cover 5 key topics and techniques essential to vocal reverb mixing that, once understood, will consistently have you mixing professional level vocals. So number 1 is understanding reverb settings. Number 2 is the importance of EQing reverb. Number 3 is adding effects to reverb. Number 4 is using multiple reverb types. And number 5, we're going to look at must-know vocal reverb tricks to take your creativity to the next level. Before we get started, I just quickly need to mention that it's really important that you watch this tutorial with a set of headphones or through a set of studio monitors. And I'm recommending this to you simply because the subtle nuances of mixing reverb just can't really be heard on smartphones or in most laptop speakers. So with that being said, let's get into the masterclass and have ourselves some fun with vocal reverb. So one thing I've noticed throughout all my years of teaching music production is that most people don't really understand how the settings of a reverb work and how to apply them correctly to get the best results. Most people generally get the basic understanding of the different reverb types, which is pretty easy for most people to get a grasp of. And number 2, they'll play around with the decay times and just kind of leave their reverb education at that. And I think the main reason people tend to do this is because the rest of the settings seem to be a little too technical, and they just don't want to be bothered with trying to learn how to use them. And another reason I know this to be true is because sadly I was actually once one of those people, and for longer than I care to admit, my reverb education came to a halt after I learned the different reverb types and a little bit about the decay times. But the main issue with that is that you'll never get a professional sounding vocal when you're just using those settings. To get a professional vocal sound, you have to understand and learn how to utilize all the reverb settings. And what I've come to find out is that they're actually not that difficult to understand. You just have to know the best way to learn how to use them. And there's actually a simple way of doing this, which I'm going to show you shortly when we get into the session. In this tutorial, we're going to cover the 5 key reverb settings and how they work towards getting you a better vocal sound. We're going to look at understanding decay, how to use pre-delay effectively, understanding diffusion, understanding damping, and understanding early reflections. And I know that it's common for a lot of reverb plugins to also include modulation settings. We're going to cover modulation in the lesson on adding effects to your reverb. So let's first take a look at understanding how decay affects our vocals. All right, y'all. So we're in the session, and the song that we're working on today is called Kehnda, and the artist's name is Jasmine Sandless, and the producer's name is Karn Walia. And this, of course, is a Punjabi song, and a lot of you don't know Punjabi music is really hitting hard right now, and there's so much talent in that world. And these two are incredibly talented, and it's been a pleasure and an honor working with these two. All right, so the first thing that we're going to look at are decay times, and there's two important things that you have to understand with decay times when it comes to mixing vocals. And number one, you generally actually want to avoid using longer decay times for vocals, and the main reason being is because this is the quickest way to actually muddy up your mix and muddy up everything else that's going on in the mix when you have longer decay times. And for me personally, I try not to do anything longer than a 3-second decay time to avoid this. Not saying that you can't have longer decay times, but you really have to be careful with this, and you really have to know what you're doing as far as treating it and EQing it. So this is something really important that you need to know when using decay times with your vocals. And number two is that you want to have the decay times in time with the beat, and this is just going to give you a better overall reverb sound as it blends in with the beat so much better. And I'm going to go over this in a lot more detail later on in the tutorial when I cover how to set your delay times in time with the beat. But for this section of the tutorial, I'm actually not going to go into that. I already have the delay time set. So the first thing that we're going to look at here is just understanding why longer decay times can cause problems when you're using reverb on your vocals. So I'm just going to pull up a reverb here. I have a large plate, and this is the one that we're going to use. I have Valhalla Vintage Verb, and I've set the decay time to 4.28 seconds, and this is essentially set to the quarter note of the tempo of this song. And what I'm going to do is just turn it up and let you hear how it sounds and how it can actually wash out the rest of the mix because of the long decay time. So just going to go back to my edit window, and we're going to play this beat, and I'm actually going to play it as the instrumental kicks in. So as we can see, that it's not that anything sounds wrong with that. It can sound good if that's the sound you're after, but the more reverb elements that you add in the mix, the more it's going to muddy up the mix. So I'm going to chop this decay time in half to 2.14. And this is essentially an 1/8 note decay time, and we're going to hear how this sounds. So as you can see, it's just not as washy, and the vocal still is giving that sense of space, but the reverb's not drowning out the rest of the mix. And this is so important when it comes to mixing vocals. So try and keep your decay time shorter, and this is one of the most important things that you need to understand when it comes to using decay on your vocals. And again, the second thing that we want to look at is making sure that the decay is in time. So I'm going to actually put this back. You can hear it a little bit better when the decay time is longer. So I'm going to put this to 4.28. And I'm going to turn this up, and just so you can see how the difference in the timing and making sure that your reverb is set to the tempo of the song can really make a big difference, especially moving forward when you start adding other effects to your reverbs. So essentially that decay time is fading out to the tempo of the song, so it just sounds much more pleasing when it's in time. So let me adjust this to a different decay time that's not in time. So as you can see, it's actually a big difference. You can hear that it's not timed. And one key thing that we're going to cover throughout this tutorial, the best way to start getting a handle on reverb, and this goes for mixing all across the board, but you have to exaggerate the reverb, and then you can really hear what all this stuff is doing. So throughout the course of this tutorial, I'm really going to be exaggerating these reverbs so you can hear what all of this stuff is doing. And this is the best way for you to practice and get a handle on reverb, is to really exaggerate it and see what these settings are doing for your reverb, and then bring it back down to taste. So these are the two important things that you have to understand when using decay on your vocals. And it's really easy. Again, I'm going to go over it later on in the tutorial as far as setting the reverb times, and then just avoiding trying to use longer decays, especially on lead vocals. And I understand that there's a lot of scenarios where you want to have a big washy reverb, and that's fine, but you just have to be careful with it on lead vocals. If you want a present lead vocal, avoid using longer decay times. And again, I normally don't even go over, I try not to go over a 3-second decay time. So doing these two things with your decay times is going to make your reverb sound so much better on your vocal. Pre-delay plays a really important role in how we control the vocal's sense of depth in the mix, meaning how forward the vocal will appear in the mix or how far back it will be in the mix. Pre-delay also controls the clarity of the vocal by controlling when the reverb engages on the vocal. And number 3, pre-delay also has a big part to play in how we creatively use reverb as well. So let's get into the session and see how this all works in action. So pre-delay is a really important aspect to use in reverb, just in general, but especially on vocals, because this is how we set the depth of our vocal in the mix. So this is how we're going to perceive how far back it's going to be or how present we want it to be. And the way that it works is that the less pre-delay, if there is no pre-delay, that means the reverb is going to hit our vocal right away, therefore giving it the impression that it's further back in the mix, because that's what reverb does, is give it space. And if we set our pre-delay higher, the higher we give it, the longer it takes for the reverb to kick in. Therefore, when that vocal is first hitting, there's no delay, there's no reverb on it, making it more present and upfront. And I'm going to just quickly show you how this works. So I'm actually going to change this decay time back to, we'll actually do a longer decay time so you can hear it a little bit better. I'm going to go back to 4.28. And I'm just going to play it with no pre-delay, and you'll see that it just hits the vocal right away. Okay, so that's 0 millisecond pre-delay. So now I'm going to turn this pre-delay way up so you can hear that there's actually a delay on the reverb. So as you can see, the further I push this pre-delay, the less you can hear the reverb on the vocal, and it's making the vocal more present in the mix. So that's why pre-delay is so important. It determines the depth of the vocal in our mix. And to use this, the best way to use pre-delay is to go back to what we were talking about with timing. We want to make sure that we actually set the proper timing with the pre-delay to make it even more effective. So the way that we would do that is actually just by multiplying this decay time. This is a quarter note, and we can just keep multiplying that by 2 or 4 or by 10, and that's going to make sure that our pre-delay is in time. And again, I'm going to go over this in more detail later on in the tutorial as far as setting times to your reverb. But as you can see, pre-delay makes a huge difference in how this vocal is going to sit in the mix. So let's just check this out one more time. That's the other cool thing with pre-delay. When you set longer pre-delay times, it's actually a great creative tool because we can have the reverb in those spaces if we want. But again, because our decay time is longer, we need to be careful with that because it could wash out the mix and make the mix a little bit muddier. But these are things that you can also do with pre-delay. So let's just check that out one more time. So the pre-delay essentially is like using a delay on your reverb. So those are things that you can play around with. But as you can see, pre-delay is really important to dialing in our reverb on our vocals and how we set the depth and how present it's going to be in the vocal. So very important. So it's really crucial that you understand what diffusion is and how it works. And it's really a common feature on reverb plugins, but never really gets utilized by new mixers. So diffusion is sometimes labeled as density or shape and usually controls both the dispersion of the reflections and their density. So with more diffusion, the reverb sounds thicker, smoother, and generally more washy. And with lower levels of diffusion, the reverb will generally sound thinner, sometimes to the point where it can't even be heard. And lower diffusion settings are associated with what we would call more regular shaped rooms or empty rooms, in which the reflections bounce from surface to surface in a pretty consistent manner. And the higher diffusion settings are associated with rooms that have an irregular shape or rooms that contain a greater range of surfaces and objects for the sound to reflect and bounce off of. So what you really need to know is that when applying diffusion to your vocals is that highly diffused reverbs can actually sound somewhat impressive, but they can also cause your mix to lose clarity and sound washed out. Lowering the diffusion can really be useful in retaining definition and preventing the reverb from overpowering the mix, but always remember to keep in mind that lowering the diffusion too much can make the reverb sound metallic and just really unpleasant and somewhat unnatural. So now that you have a better understanding of diffusion, let's get into the session and check out how diffusion affects your vocals in action. All right, so the next thing we're going to look at is diffusion and how diffusion affects our vocals when we're using reverb. And on this particular plugin, you can see we have the shape setting here, and then the DIFF is for diffusion, but this is actually early and late reflections, and we're going to go over that a little bit later in this tutorial. Right now, we're going to actually use the shape. This is essentially sets the relative room size of the reverb and can make a huge difference in how your reverb affects the vocal. So let's just play around with this. So as you can see, that made a huge difference in how that reverb sounded and how that shaped its vocals. So when I pulled the size back, that just opened everything up and made the reverb in the room so much bigger. And of course, that's not going to be good as far as washing out the mix and adding mud to our mix. So again, this is one of those key elements of reverb. And as you can see, this stuff, it's not very technical, but what you have to do is just make sure you exaggerate the reverb so you hear what it's doing to the signal, and then it's a lot easier to figure out exactly what it is and what it's doing. So let's just hear that one more time. So again, if you are using a reverb that has this setting, then this is a really key setting to play around with when you're dialing in your reverb. So that is diffusion and shape, adjusting the relative size of the room with the particular focal setting or reverb type that you're using within that context. Damping is also a really crucial setting to reverb and plays a major role in how your vocals are going to sit in the mix. But luckily, using damping is actually pretty easy to understand and apply once we know what it is. And the best way to understand damping is by looking at it as an EQ, because damping essentially controls the absorption of the high and low end frequencies that reverbs produce, which an EQ actually does this as well, but we'll discuss this later on in the tutorial. So most important to understand about damping is that high frequencies decay faster than low frequencies and generally need to be controlled more when applying reverb to your vocals. So always keep in mind that the precise control of damping plays a major role in how your vocals are going to sit in the mix, because this is how we control the brightness and the darkness of our reverb. So now that we have an overview of damping, let's get into the session and see how this all works in action. Okay, so the next thing we're going to look at is damping, and I think the best way to explain this is to look at it as an EQ, because that's essentially what it's doing, is lowering the high-end frequencies and the low-end frequencies of the reverb tails. So I'm actually just going to pull in this EQ here, and this is actually on the reverb track. And I'm going to show you essentially what damping is doing, because this particular reverb, you're just adjusting the controls, but you can't visually see it. So I'm just going to play this reverb, and I'm going to pull in a shelf, because this is essentially what this is doing, and this is going to dampen the high-end frequencies of this reverb. And the reason why damping is important is because those high-end frequencies, again, this is all relative to your mix, but they can really get in the way of your vocal and the rest of your mix. So EQing and damping these frequencies is really important to cleaning up your reverb to get a nice present vocal, but still giving it the space and the depth that you want. So again, this is high-end frequencies that I was doing, and I just put a shelf on it, and it's the same with the low-end frequencies. Essentially, we'd be using a shelf and damping the low-end frequencies, and we'll get more into that when we get into EQing reverb. But damping is essentially a form of EQing your reverb, and that's the best way to explain it for you guys to understand it. So again, I'm going to play this track, and I'm just going to apply this high shelf here. So I've pulled down those high frequencies, those high tails to 4300. So again, it's just like pulling down a shelf on an EQ. And this is how we tame and kind of shape our EQ and our vocal to sit in the mix the way that we want it. Because again, if I pull this back and you hear all those high-end frequencies, that's not good for our mix. And again, I have this reverb exaggerated. Of course, I wouldn't use it this loud, but this is the best way for you guys to be able to hear what all this stuff is doing. And so I'm going to just pull this back. So as you can see, that makes a huge difference. And then conversely, these bass frequencies is essentially putting a shelf on the low end frequencies. I have it here set to 750. So the shelf would be set to 750 Hertz. And this is pulling down all those bass frequencies. So let's hear how this sounds. So again, this damping is just essentially acting as a reverb. But as you can see, this is really, really crucial on how you're going to shape your reverb sound, because those long tails, if they're not controlled, they're just going to wash out your mix and muddy everything up. So damping is very, very important element when using reverb on your vocals. So using and understanding early reflections is probably the last element of a reverb that people learn, and that's if they even end up learning it at all. Because for one, a lot of reverbs actually just don't have the setting, and two, it's just very difficult for people to see how this can really get them better results in their mixes. But everything has its purpose and its place and wouldn't be there if it wasn't important. So early reflections are the reflections that reach the listener a few milliseconds after the direct signal arrives, and our brains use them to identify the size of the room that we're in. So when we're trying to emulate a specific space or room, early reflections actually play a really big role in this. So essentially, the louder the early reflection, the smaller the room will seem, and conversely, the quieter the early reflections, the larger the room will sound. So now that we have more of an understanding of early reflections, let's get into the session and see how this all works on our vocals. Okay, so now we're going to look at early reflections, and this is probably the most subtle of all of the reverb settings and isn't going to crazily affect your reverb sound, but it's still important to know these settings. They all have their place in reverb, and the more that you get into reverb, the more that you need to understand all this stuff, as it all adds up over time, like everything in mixing. So here we have our section, and these are early and late reflections. So essentially, the louder this early reflection, the smaller the perceived room size is going to be within the context of whatever reverb type that you've chose. So let's play around with this early deflection and early reflection, and see how it sounds on the vocal. So when I pull this early reflection back, you can hear that it's making the room space of the vocal sound bigger. So let's listen to this one more time. So what it's doing is just making the perceived room size sounding a little bit bigger. As you can see, it's not making drastic changes to the reverb, but it is there, and it is subtle, and it is something that you can use to dial in your reverb. So let's check out what the late reflections are also doing here. As you can see, it says it controls the rate at which the echo density builds over time. So let's hear how this is affecting our vocal. You can hear we're even actually getting some distortion in that reverb when I'm pulling this all the way back. So again, all of this stuff does matter. And again, even though this is a little more subtle, you can see that it can add distortion to the signal when I pull this all the way back. So let's hear that one more time. So as you can see, this is really affecting the density of that reverb. When I pull it back, it sounds a lot thinner. And then the more I go towards 100%, it's a lot denser. So let's just hear that one more time. So as you can see, it can make a big difference in how you're shaping your reverb. And again, this is early reflections and late reflections. And not a lot of reverbs have this, but once you start getting more into reverb, then a lot of the more advanced reverb plugins are going to have all these settings for you guys to play around with. So now that we've gone through all of the settings on these more advanced reverb plugins, you can hear how big of a difference that it makes in shaping your reverb sound and how your vocal is going to sit in the mix. So try and get out of your comfort zone when it comes to using reverbs and just finding a reverb type like a hall or a church and then just adjusting your decay. It goes much, much further than that, shaping your reverb. And this is how you're going to get a much more professional lead vocal sound. And it's not just lead vocals, it's just everything. Understanding all this stuff applies to all mixing across the board, whether it's just vocals or instruments. So now that you have a better understanding of these settings, you're going to be able to take your vocal mixes to a whole nother level. So the importance of EQing your reverbs definitely goes hand in hand with damping, but it also goes a lot further. And in my opinion, how you EQ your reverb is what makes or breaks great vocal reverb treatment. And out of everything that we've discussed so far and eventually will discuss in this tutorial, this is probably the most important subject that you need to understand when it comes to mixing vocals and really just using reverb across the board, because using an EQ on a reverb is how we shape our vocal to fit in the mix, to give our vocals clarity, and most importantly, avoid that nasty three-letter word known as mud. So now let's take a look at how to use EQ on our reverbs to shape our vocals and why it's such a powerful technique when mixing vocals. So for me, using EQ on your reverbs is going to be the biggest deciding factor in how your reverb is going to shape and form in context to the rest of your mix. And a lot of reverb plugins are going to have some sort of EQing. So on this one, we have an EQ section here, and these are just filters. It has a high cut and a low cut. And then of course, damping also helps with this. And this will work. If this is all you have, this will work. But generally you can have an EQ plugin, and it's best to actually have a dedicated EQ plugin on top of your reverb effects in. So I'm going to pull up my effects in here. We're still just working with this large plate, and I have an EQ here after my reverb plugin, and we're going to use this EQ, and I'm going to show you how important using EQ to shape your reverb is. So let's go back to our edit window, and let's just play this vocal here. I can actually play it in this section without the beat. You probably are going to be able to hear this a little bit better. Sorry, I got to pull back the this here, and then also I'm going to pull down this reverb a little bit here. Okay, let's hear that again. So right here you can see where this reverb lies, and right away once we can see it visually, we just know where we need to clean it up first of all. And this is like doing anything with mixing, cleaning up, whether it's a vocal or an instrument. We just get rid of everything that we're not using, because this, again, over time it builds up and it's going to muddy up our mix. So the first thing we want to do is clean up this reverb. So just in reference to this reverb here, get rid of this one. I'm going to pull this EQ back up here. This high cut and this low cut is essentially what we're going to be doing here. I'm on the wrong one here. This high cut is the same setting that we have on the reverb. So I'm going to show you what this is going to do to all of the high end frequencies. So me just doing that shows you how powerful and why using EQ is so important on reverb. Not only does it have the ability to clean it up, but there's also a lot of creative things we can even do with that as well. And that's just using the filters. So if I pull in some bands here and start pulling up and pulling down frequencies, you can hear what it does as well. So if I stop it here, this is a really important EQ technique and tip to keep in mind for you guys moving forward. This is a great way to get the vocal more present. If we pull it down where the fundamental frequency is of the vocal is actually just going to naturally be more present. So I'm going to boost this so you can hear what it's doing, and then I'm going to pull it back down the taste, and you'll see how much more present the vocal can be. So as you can see, that vocal's much more present just by dipping out this frequency around 2200. It just makes that vocal stand out so much more. And again, being able to dial in and just play around with these EQ settings is going to essentially, in a lot of ways, just kind of make or break your vocal reverb treatment. This is essential to getting a professional reverb sound. And again, I highly recommend using a dedicated EQ when you're doing this, and play around with it, because it just gives you so many more options to play around with. And again, you can see that this can be used as a cleanup tool and as an incredible creative tool as well when it comes to using your reverbs. So make sure whenever you're using your reverbs, you're always dialing in and playing with the EQ as well. Once you have your other settings on the reverb set to how you want it, then you want to bring in an EQ and shape it even more. This is so important to understand. And once you understand this, your mixes are just going to go to a whole completely new level. Up until now, we've mainly covered the technical aspects of using reverb on our vocals, and now it's time to explore the amazing creative uses of reverb, which I know is probably the main reason a lot of you are actually watching this tutorial as we speak. Always remember that understanding the technical use of reverb is paramount and essential to be able to use it creatively in the most effective ways. We need both sides of the tool to really be able to put it all together and achieve the best results. But it's the creative use of reverb that really separates a good mix from a great mix, and this is one of the best tools we have at our disposal to make our mix much more immersive, and more importantly, dictate the emotion of the vocal, and therefore dictate the emotion of the song. And it's very important for new mixers to know that bringing the proper emotion out of a song is in large part the mixer's responsibility. And I can confidently tell you that your ability to do this, or lack of ability to do this, will determine how good your mix really is in the eyes of your peers, professionals, and most importantly, your audience. And in my opinion, the best way to bring the emotion out of a mix is through creative use of reverb. So in this section of the tutorial, we're going to look at powerful techniques of using effects on your reverbs and how it can transform your vocal mixes to a whole nother level. All right, so now we're getting to the fun part of this tutorial, and we're going to talk about adding effects to a reverb. Now, this is something that it's just pretty much endless as far as what you can do. There's no right or wrong way to go about doing this, and that's the cool thing about it. It's just wherever your creativity takes you, and you can get really, really unique sounds, and it'll just kind of separate you from the rest of the pack when it comes to mixing and using reverb. So I'm actually just going to put this EQ to default and just show you what I have. So we're going to continue on with just using this large plate here. And this is my effects end, and I have my EQ here. I'm actually just going to get rid of this Pro R plugin, and I'm just going to cycle through some things that just through different effects that you can use. So the first thing that I want to show you guys is actually I'm going to pull this down here, is using delays on your reverb, which is a really, really cool technique. So I'm just going to pull in this Echo Boy, and let's hear how it sounds. So basically what this is doing, this is kind of like using a pre-delay, but a pre-delay on steroids is what it's doing. We can really have a lot of fun with using delays on our reverb. So let's just play around with this a little bit more. I'm going to start with an 8th note and then just kind of go up, and you can see how it sounds. And I have the feedback way up here also too, so you can hear what the delay is doing to the reverb. And also what it's doing is, again, it's kind of setting a pre-delay, and it's making that vocal more present, and the reverb's kicking in after it hits the signal, which is really cool. So that's an 8th note. Let's see how a quarter note sounds. So that sounds cool as well. Let's check out a half note. I really like that one. So as you can see, you could really have a lot of fun with this if you were to dial it in. And again, my reverb's really exaggerated now, but when you pull that into taste, it can really, really sound good. And I'm just going to keep my reverb exaggerated so you guys can hear what all this stuff is doing to the signal. So that's delay. Let's check out modulation. So I'm actually just going to use, for now, I'm going to use this chorusing plugin, so you can see what chorusing can do, and again, using phasers and flangers can also bring a really, really cool effect to your reverb. So let's bring this in here and see how it sounds. that sounds pretty cool. And essentially, the modulation settings that are on a lot of reverbs, they can get you some sort of a similar sound, but obviously not quite as much as applying a dedicated modulation plugin to your reverb effects. And that's why I tend to not use the modulation settings that are on the reverbs. I like, if I am gonna use that that effect, I'm just gonna bring in a dedicated one. So as you can see, that sounds really, really cool. So let's try maybe a flanger and see how that sounds. So that also sounds really cool too. I actually like that. You can have a lot of fun with using modulation. So the next thing we're going to look at is using distortion. And I'm going to bring in, let's bring in the decapitator here and see how this sounds. Distortion can also be really, really cool effect to put on your reverb. So let's check this out. So what I like about using distortion on reverb is that it just gives a sense of making the reverb sound a bit bigger. And again, the bigger isn't always good when it comes to reverb. We always have to have that balance with the right amount of space, but still keeping the vocal clear and intelligible. But I tend to use distortion a lot on my reverbs. I really like what it does. So this is something really cool to play around with as well. And another thing that I want to show you, and this is something that I do on pretty much every one of my vocals, is widen it. And the reason why I do that is because it creates a little more space for the vocal to sit in the middle of the reverb. So we're essentially spreading the reverb more to the sides and giving the vocal space in the middle. So I'm going to pull up, I'm not going to use this one. I'm going to use the A1 Stereo Control. This is a free plugin that you guys can use to try this out. So let's put it on the track. I'm actually going to mute this decapitator here and see what it's doing to the signal. So this is doing two things, and this is why I really love using these stereo width plugins on reverb. So naturally, because you're widening it, it's just making the stereo field wider, and the vocal is going to be perceived as being wider because the reverb is spread out. So one, it makes your vocal bigger, and then two, it can allow you to actually carve more space for the vocal in the middle. So this is actually probably this is the effect that I would say I probably use most on my reverbs, because I like how it makes the vocal bigger but still gives it more space in the center. This is a really, really huge technique that I like doing. And to take this further, if what you can do, which is really cool, you could create a separate reverb effects end, and you can create, you know, one effect on one side where you have maybe some distortion on one side, and then on the other side you can add a phaser to the right side of the signal, and you can really just have a lot of fun with this. So as you can see, this is just some examples of some things you can do, and you can just add them up, you can stack them up, you can put a delay, a distortion plugin, a modulation plugin. You can kind of just do it all, and it doesn't stop there. You can put any effect on your reverb and really just, again, have a lot of fun with this. And this is really gonna make your vocal mixes more exciting and just, again, stand out from the rest of the pack when you're doing your mixing and adding your reverb to your vocals. So some of you might be wondering, what do I mean by using multiple reverb types? So the idea behind this particular technique is to put the vocal in a space inside of another space. So for example, you can add a plate reverb to a vocal, then on top of that plate, you can add a second hall reverb to that vocal. And this is one of my favorite reverb techniques that I utilize on almost every vocal that I mix. And I really love sharing this particular tip because it's something I know a lot of new mixers just wouldn't think of doing, but it can be extremely effective in getting an incredible vocal reverb sound. And this technique can work really, really well on any type of pop lead vocal that needs to be mixed with a lot of space. The same principle applies here with the concept of using any two of the same effects processors on one track, because pushing one specific plugin too hard generally isn't going to be pleasing to the ear or musical, but gently using two of the same effects plugins can often yield you a much better result. And with using multiple reverbs on a vocal, there's also an added creative benefit as well, because naturally different reverb types bring different tones and textures, and blending them together to get one overall sound can really take your vocal mixes to the next level. Not only is this an extremely effective technique, but it's also really, really easy to implement. So let's get into the session and explore using multiple reverb types on your vocals. Okay, so now we're gonna look at using multiple reverb types. And again, I really like this technique and this trick. It's not really a trick, it's actually just a technique. But it's just something a lot of people don't think about doing, especially when you're newer to mixing. But you can not only have a lot of fun with it, but it can just make a big difference in how your vocal turns out. So how this works is, I'm gonna go back to the edit window here. I'm gonna get rid of this. So first, I'm gonna bring in a room reverb here. I'm gonna put this vocal inside of the room. The whole idea behind this technique is to put a space inside of a space, and it's actually not uncommon for me to use up to 3 or 4 different reverbs on a vocal, different reverb types. So I'm gonna put this room reverb on this vocal so you can see what I mean here.
ਉੱਥੇ ਬੈਠਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਕਰੀ ਜਾਣਾ ਏ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਤੇਰੇ ਬਿਨਾ ਕੱਲੇ ਹੋਏ ਆ ਸ਼ਦਾਈ ਕਿ ਤੂੰ ਵੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਬੇਗਾਨਾ ਏ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਕੱਲੇ ਰੋਈ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਜੁਦਾਈ.
Okay, so we have a room reverb there, and now I'm gonna pull our large plate in, but I'm gonna pull the large plate down more into taste so you guys can really see how this effect is working.
ਉੱਥੇ ਬੈਠਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਕਰੀ ਜਾਣਾ ਏ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਤੇਰੇ ਬਿਨਾ ਕੱਲੇ ਹੋਏ ਆ ਸ਼ਦਾਈ ਕਿ ਤੂੰ ਵੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਬੇਗਾਨਾ ਏ.
Sorry, I'm gonna A/B this room so you can see how big of a difference it is, how it's adding to the effect, the reverb effect.
ਕਿ ਤੂੰ ਉੱਥੇ ਬੈਠਾ ਮੈਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਕਰੀ ਜਾਣਾ ਏ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਤੇਰੇ ਬਿਨਾ ਕੱਲੇ ਹੋਏ ਆ ਸ਼ਦਾਈ ਕਿ ਤੂੰ ਵੀ ਦੁਨੀਆ ਤੋਂ ਹੋ ਗਿਆ ਬੇਗਾਨਾ ਏ ਕਿ ਆਪਾਂ ਇੱਥੇ ਕੱਲੇ ਰੋਈ ਜਾਂਦੇ ਆ ਜੁਦਾਈ.
So as you can see, that's a huge difference. And just the room reverb on its own, of course, it wasn't doing much, but when you add both of them together, it just gives it a much more unique and cool reverb sound. And again, you can take this further, but you have to be careful. You don't want to add too much. We always need to have that balance, but you can take this further and you can add a different hall or a chamber reverb and put a space inside of a space inside of a space, and it's just really just going to give you a lot more of a unique vocal sound. So let's just listen to this one more time. I'm going to A-B these. So right there, I was A-Bing the large plate, but as you can see, like using one of them on their own, it just doesn't sound as big and as exciting. And again, this is just something a lot of new mixers wouldn't think of doing, but it makes a huge difference. And on any type of vocal like this, especially singing vocals, I always use multiple reverb types. And again, I can use up to 3 or 4 different reverb types to really shape that reverb sound. So this is a really, really cool technique to take with you guys. So now is the time of the tutorial where we get to head into the really, really fun stuff when it comes to vocal reverb mixing and look at some game-changing tricks that are guaranteed to take your vocal mixes to a completely whole new level. And all these tricks that I'm about to show you actually completely revolutionize my vocal mixes, and I couldn't be happier to share them here with you guys today in this video. So in this part of the tutorial, we're going to take a look at 4 of my favorite vocal reverb tricks, which are number 1, how to get a perfectly timed reverb every time you mix. Number 2, what I like to call using reverb rides. Number 3, using reverse reverbs. And number 4, we'll look at the great technique of sidechaining reverbs and delays. Getting perfectly timed reverbs is such an easy and effective trick to utilize when mixing vocals, and it's definitely one of those small things in mixing that really has the ability to give us huge results. So let's get into the session and see how this incredible technique works in action. All right, so the first reverb trick we're going to look at here is setting your reverb times, and this is something that's really easy to do. So all you have to do is take the number 60,000 and divide that by the tempo of the song. And once you've done that, then you want to take that number and then move the decimal point over 2 points. And I'll show you what I mean. So for example, in this song, the tempo is 140. And when I divide that by 60,000, then I get 428. And what I need to do is move that decimal point over to 4.28. And that's essentially how you're going to get the quarter note of that session or of the tempo. And it's really just that easy. Again, I had done this earlier. Sorry, this should be an 8. 4.28. And that's our decay time. And again, that's the quarter note. So if you divide it by 2, then you'll get the decay time of 2.14 and so on, or you can multiply it if you want longer decay times. But the important thing to keep in mind when you're setting your delay times is not only to set the decay, but also to set the pre-delays. So now that we have our decay time set, it's important to set the pre-delay as well to make sure the pre-delay is in time if we're using pre-delay. And the same thing would apply here. You just multiply it by 2 or 4, whatever it might be, and take it as high as you want. But we got to make sure that that pre-delay is also in time with the decay, or the effect just won't be as effective. So let's actually just, we kind of did it a little bit earlier in the tutorial, but let's take another look at this and see how it affects the vocal. So I'm actually going to put this to 2.14, and this is the 8th note. And let's see how much better it sounds when it's in time. Especially on a song like this, it's really important to have the decay time set because she's singing in pockets and it sounds so much more pleasing to the ear and just sounds better when the decay is fading out to the time of the tempo. It's really important. So I'm going to adjust this decay time where it's not in time, and you can see the difference that it makes. So it's a subtle difference, but it's one of those things that's actually a big difference. And I'm going to play around with this pre-delay as well. I'm going to set it to 21.4 and see how the pre-delay sounds when it's timed to the session. So as you can see, when it is in time, it just makes everything more in sync. And this is just something easy you can do. It's not like it takes a lot of time. You just whip out your phone or a calculator, boom, it's done, it's set. And you need to do this with all of your reverb. So if you're applying multiple reverb types to your vocal, then you want to make sure all of the delays are set in time. And again, this might seem like a small thing, but it actually can and will make a big difference, especially in a song like this where there's pockets and that reverb is kind of carrying over and you can hear it. It's very present in the mix. It just sounds better if it's in time and decaying in time with the song. So huge tip here. Something that I use on every mix. This is pretty much automatic. When I'm pulling up my reverb now, I just set the time and then work with it in that way. So this technique that I like to call a reverb ride is a really powerful way to bring emotion and movement to a vocal, and works really, really well in arrangement transitions. And this is definitely one of my favorite reverb tricks that I like to utilize in all my vocal mixes. So let's get right into the session and see how it works in action. Okay, so the next must-know reverb trick is what I call Reverb Rides, and they're just really interesting way to help with transitions in the beats. And I'm going to show you what I mean here. And this is a really good example to show you guys actually in this particular song. So let's just play this here first. So this section right here before the beat kicks in, what we want to do is actually just raise the reverb really high in that section and just give it a big feel. And this actually works better with the longer decay times, this particular technique, but we only do it in sections, so it's not going to wash out the whole mix. And I'm going to show you what I mean here. So this involves a little bit of automation with your plugin. So I have the large plate here, and what I'm going to do is go here to level, and I'm just going to get this out of the way. And what I want to do is just bring this reverb up in this particular section. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more, and if I go here, actually no, it's this section. So there's a couple ways to go about doing this. One, I can just raise the whole level of this section. And I'm going to actually pull this down a bit so you can hear the effect better. Okay, so let's hear how this sounds. One more time. So as you can see, it's just a nice build up going into the transition to when the chorus comes in and the beat kicks in. And this is one way of doing it, of just pulling it all the way up. The other way of doing it is actually having it gradually come up, and this can work for longer reverb rides. It doesn't have to be on small sections of this. If you say you have a bridge section and there's kind of a big buildup, you can actually have a long reverb ride throughout that whole section. But just to quickly show you an example of this, let's hear how this sounds as well. So we're going to want to do that a little bit more here. Let's hear that one more time. So that sounds really cool. So these are two ways that you can actually go about doing this. And as you can see, it's a really, really easy technique, but it's a powerful technique as it's just more engaging, and it just kind of brings the listener more into the song, and just that transition just sounds so much bigger and better. So this is what I call reverb rides, and this is a great trick that I like to use on a lot of my tracks. The technique of sidechaining reverbs was a big game changer for me because it's so useful when it comes to trying to get a clear and present vocal in specific sections of the vocal. And I'll show you what I mean by that in a second, but this is definitely more of an advanced mixing technique and requires some experience with mixing to be able to apply it correctly. But just being able to know and utilize this technique is what, in my opinion, separates a novice mix from a pro mix, and I'll show you why I believe this to be true right now in the session. All right, so the next trick that we're going to look at here is a complete game changer, and you're going to see why here in a second. And again, this is more of an advanced mixing technique, but once you're able to understand it and apply it, this can really make a huge difference in how your vocals and your reverbs and delays are going to turn out. And this is a sidechaining technique, and again, it works hand in hand with reverbs and delays. So I'm just going to show you both in this tutorial. First, I'm going to show you how to set it up, and then I'm going to show you how to apply it on your vocals. So the first thing that we have to do is go to our effects end, and I have a delay and a reverb here, and then I have it going in to, I'm actually just going to mute this EQ here, and then I have this reverb going into a compressor. So we need to pull up a compressor on our reverb effects end, and I'm actually just going to get this out of here so there's no confusion. So this compressor is coming in right after my reverb, and what we want to do is set a key input, and I'm just going to use bus 2 here, and on this particular plugin we want to make sure that it's set to an external sidechain. And then what we do is we go into the track that we want it on. So this is my lead vocal track, and I am going to pull up bus 2 here. So now this sidechain is affecting the reverb. And then the next thing that we need to do is bring in the actual reverb effects in. And I believe it was on a half note delay. Let's just go back here. Yes, it was on the half note delay bus. So now what we want to do is I'm just going to play this vocal. So that's the reverb. I'm bringing in the reverb now directly on this track. And a lot of times reverb can get in the way of our vocal, especially in a situation like this when the verse is starting to kick in. We might want that vocal more present, but we still want the reverb tails after she finishes singing. And I'm going to show you what I mean here. So I just pulled on the reverb here, and now I'm going to bring in the sidechain effects in. Just going to pull these over. Okay, so here's how this works. So essentially what this is doing is that when the vocal kicks in, it's actually compressing the reverb so that vocal is more present. And then as the vocal dies out, the reverb kicks back in, and it just gives it a really cool effect as far as creativity is concerned, but also from a technical standpoint, that vocal is much more intelligible now too than just drowning it out in a bunch of reverb. So let's hear how that sounds again. So I'm going to pull this reverb down a bit. Man, that sounds really, really nice. I really like how that sounds. As you can see, this is why I feel this is such a game changer. It can really add a huge creative element and uniqueness to your mix, and it's important, like, to so to adjust this properly, let's just quickly go over the settings here on the compressor. So you generally want to have a higher threshold here, and this is all just depends on how much reverb you want to have on the vocal. So let's play around with the threshold. Now this is a good compressor because you can see visually what it's doing. So we pull back the threshold, and again, this is just going to be to taste for your specific vocal how much reverb you actually want on the vocal while it's playing. And then the attack is going to set, of course, when the compressor engages on that reverb. And then the most important setting here is probably this release setting, because this is going to dictate when that reverb starts coming back into the signal. So generally with a release, you want more of a medium type release. You want it to sound natural. So as you can see, when I pulled it fast, it was just that compressor was just coming in and out, in and out. You want it to be as natural as possible. So you want more of a medium to even a later release time. So I'm going to mute these so you can see how big of a difference side chaining can make. So I'm going to mute this reverb. All right, sorry, I'm going to mute the side chain. Man, that sounds beautiful. So I really love this technique. And the beautiful thing about this technique is that it works really well with delays. And while I have this going, I'm just going to quickly show you how great it sounds with delays as well. So I'll actually leave that the reverb on, and then I'm going to bring in actually I'm going to mute the reverb, and we'll just listen to what this is doing for the delay. So let's hear this. Because a lot of times we don't want our delays to be clogging up the vocal too much, and this is a really cool technique. We just kind of want it at the tails of the pockets, and this is a really useful technique to accomplish this. So watch what happens when I take this side chaining off. So of course that's not what we'd want to be after. We want it as a tail, and this is a great technique to do this with your delays. So let's hear this one more time. So that delay, it has just a soft undertone under that vocal when the sidechain, when the compression is kicking in, which sounds, it's not overpowering the vocal, but when it releases, then we still get that delay tail. So sidechaining is a really powerful technique when it comes to using reverbs and delays from a creative and a technical standpoint. So the technique of using reverse reverbs has actually been around for a long time, but it's still a fairly popular technique used by producers and mixers, and it's just always a great trick to have in your back pocket, as it can add a lot of uniqueness to your production. So let's get right into the session and see how this works in action. Okay, so the last trick that we're going to cover to round out this vocal reverb mixing masterclass is the classic trick of using a reverse reverb, and this is actually something really easy to do. And again, this technique's been around for a long time, and it's just because it's just a really unique trick, and it just works, and it's a great trick to use in in transition. So when you're transitioning to a different section of a song, this can be a really cool technique, and it's really easy to do. So what you want to do is duplicate a track and then take the section. So in this particular part of the beat, I've muted this this kind of cymbal riser here. I'll show you what I mean. So say you didn't have this and we muted that. Say it just doesn't transition well. So what we can do is do a reverse reverb to do that. So again, what we want to do in that section, we're just going to take this part of the vocal that we want to reverse, and we are going to bring it, I gotta section that off. And then we're gonna bring it into a new track. And the key to this is for this to actually be a gradual thing, we wanna highlight this section, but we wanna give it some space when we're highlighting it. So we don't just wanna highlight this section, we wanna actually give it some space to allow for the buildup. And you'll see what I mean here in a second. And you can do this in any DAW. This isn't just specific to Pro Tools. Most DAWs have a reverse feature on it. But in Pro Tools, if you are using Pro Tools, you have to do this through the audio suite. And we have to go through Reverb and grab our Deverb. And when we go through audio suite, it has the reverse function right on here. So what we want to do, and the settings on the reverb aren't as important, and for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to leave the settings as they are. And what we want to do is reverse this, and then we want to render it. So now what we want to do is just kind of place this in the pocket where we want it. So we kind of want to have that and right where the beat drops. Let's get rid of that, and let's hear it one more time. And that's a reverse reverb, and you can use this, like I said, I find it works best in transitions, but you can just play around with it and have some fun with it. And again, you know, if you don't have a riser, you just want to try something new, you could even do this on top of a riser, any type of transition, but it's just a cool trick. Again, it's been around for a long time, and it's just really effective. The challenge of using reverb effectively on our vocals is something we all struggle with as mixers, but I know with the mastery of these tips and techniques that I've covered here in this tutorial, you'll be able to finally get so much more consistency in that crazy journey of being able to achieve that perfect reverb sound on every vocal. So now the most important thing to do is practice these techniques and concepts and give yourself time to be able to use them and apply them effectively, because perfect vocal mixes won't come overnight, and unfortunately neither does mastering reverb. So like I always say, just try and be patient and persistent, and the desired result that you're after will eventually come. So until next time, I hope this information was really helpful to you in some way, shape, or form, and I really appreciate you supporting Intession Music Tech, and I'll see y'all soon on the next tutorial.